Another episode of Con2Couch. With so many conventions having to delay or cancel this year, we're bringing some of the best parts of that experience right to you in the comfort of your own home. If things like Saturday morning cartoons and Dungeons and Dragons were part of your childhood, you're in the right place because we're going on some adventures in the 80s with our guest today. We're thrilled to have Flint Dille and Paul Dini, both extremely accomplished writers and producers with decade-spanning careers who got their start in the 80s animation scene. They're joined by former Marvel and DC Comics color artist and Ultimate 80s superfan Brett Smith. We'll be talking about all things 80s as it relates to Paul and Flint's careers and the inspirations they provided Brett in his career. We'll also talk about Flint's upcoming book entitled The Games Master, almost famous in the geek 80s. And without further ado, here's our host, Jack Clemens.
Hi, everybody. Mike said, we've got a killer 80s lineup today. So it doesn't matter if you grew up in the 80s and this is actual nostalgia for you, or if you're just an 80s loving fanatic. You're going to have a great show today, but let's go ahead and get our guests to introduce themselves. Paul, could we start with you?
Hi, Paul Dini. I'm a writer, producer for animation, such shows as Batman, Superman, everything at Warner Brothers, going back till the early '90s, I guess. And currently writing some Batman stuff and a bunch of other things that I can't talk about, but let's talk about the good stuff.
Flint?
Oh, yeah. Well, since we vowed not to talk about anything after 1992, or is it 19 weeks turned into 95? For the purpose of this conversation, let's see. When 1980 started, I'd just gotten out of film school. Then I got hired by Ruby Spears, which is Paul and I'll get to that in a second. Then I went to Lucasfilm. In the middle of that, I met Gary Gygax and he's the guy that created D&D and started designing games. And then went to Sunbow and did Transformers and G.I. Joe and Inhumanoids and Visionaries and the much talked about Muscle Machines. And by the end of this decade, Paul and I made the Lucasfilm journey. We can talk about that. It's embarrassing for me. Great for him. And then later on, we both ended up at Amblin at the end of this year. Oh, yeah, those Garbage Pail Kids in the meantime. That's another embarrassing.
Wow. Yeah.
Packed resumes. Brett, yourself?
Brett Smith. I'm a professional commercial artist. I work in the graphic novel industry as an editor, creative director, and a book packager. I'm also worked as a color artist in the comic book industry for Marvel and DC Comics. I'm also a storyboard artist in the animation industry and a graphic artist for multiple clients. I got my start in the mid-'90s. I was hired out of high school for Chaos Comics during the Bad Girl craze. And I am also the key demographic for in the mid '80s for Paul and Flint. I'm a bicentennial baby, so I was born in '76. So that put me 9-10 years old in '85, '86. I mean, I was.
You were dead center of our market there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks
for
watching.
We're the same age.
That's why this was. I've been looking forward to this for a week because they always say never meet your heroes, but 90% of my heroes that I've met have been really great experiences. So to you guys,
we'll help normalize that curve.
Don't blow it.
So we do want to say, like Flint said, that we're going to be putting a hard cap around 92 to 95 in what we're going to talk about today, so we can really stay in the true retro wave of the 80s. But you guys brought something up earlier, and I want to make sure that we go ahead and talk about it. Your friend Marty Pasko, who recently passed away.
Yeah.
Marty passed away this week. He was 65, and we both worked with him. Just about everybody in the industry worked with Marty. He's a very talented writer, very passionate soul, good guy, funny guy. And his death hit us very suddenly. I knew that he had a few health problems, but I never expected anything like this.
Yeah, no.
What was the first time you met Marty, Flint?
Marty and Steve Gerber taught me how to write animation. I first met Marty Pasko when we were working on a show called Mr. T, timeless and unforgettable show, right? And and we would do these all-night sessions, and I'm in there with Marty and Steve, okay, and Marty, as and I mean this affectionately, but we have to tell the story, was rather persnickety about things, okay, and and Steve a little bit less so, but I mean, I may have come out of USC film school. These guys were like sergeants who'd actually fought in battles and like were vets. And I was so noob. And they got me through it. We wrote like 3 or 4 Mr. T's together, and that started my career. But the one moment I earned respect from these guys, I mean, you have to understand, I was actually wasn't that much younger than Marty, but I was infinitely a little more immature. Marty, everybody thought he was adopted, right? That everybody thought his real father was William Shatner, because he kind of acted like William Shatner in his more emotive moments. I mean, that was like a serious rumor going around that was at a believometer level of probably 3 in 10 of me believed that. Okay, it wasn't like totally out of possibility. Anyway, is one night we were doing the Mystery of the Forbidden Monastery. I'm sure you've all watched it several times. And, just kidding. There'd be no reason to watch that. But I said, we were in a monastery, and I said, they're at a refectory table. And Marty and Steve both like whip snapped around. The story can get relevant in a second. And looked up the word, thinking I just made something up. And indeed, that's what a table in a monastery is called. And they thought, this guy really is actually educated. Truth is, right behind me is the refectory table I was referring to. It's now my son's desk. So anyway, that was how I proved my worth to Marty and Steve.
I proved mine by saying to Steve, "I love Howard the Duck," and he said, "Okay, sit down."
Yeah, exactly. Well, Steve's a really important guy to talk to too. I mean, I would love to spend a moment talking about Ruby Spears, because it's funny. Everybody talks about Sunbow and Warner's and all the stuff afterwards. Ruby Spears is what forged that era. I would personally argue that, because the team that we had there was basically the team that went on to be Sunbow, went on to be much later on TSR Comics, but falls into the 92 cap. And it would be a network we still work with. And people, except unfortunately, a lot of them have died. But Ruby Spears was a company run. Well, Paul can do the history of Ruby Spears better than I can, because I mean, he remembers all sorts of details and was actually there when it was founded, whereas I was not. Even though he actually came to the company later than I did.
I'll just do a fast digression. Ruby Spears was a company put together by Joe Ruby and Ken Spears. These were the 2 gentlemen who had worked as editors for a long time over at Hanna-Barbera, and they were looking to make the transition as writers. And one of the first things they came up with were the framework of the show that eventually became Scooby-Doo. It was kind of worked for a long time, like the network, CBS, wanted something with teenagers to kind of follow the success of Archie show that had been done in around 1968. Joe and Ken worked with Bill, Hanna, and Joe Barbera to come up with something that was more along the lines of a mystery that had some elements of rock and roll in it, and of course a dog, which is the hallmark of every HB show. And eventually, after several mutations, that became Scooby-Doo, and the ghost chasing kind of Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein theme to the thing. They got very popular doing shows like that, 3 kids and a dog, 3 kids and a whatever. And then Joe and Ken started their own studio, Ruby Spears, and their first big show was, of course, like 3 kids and a werewolf, or 4 kids and a werewolf, or no, essentially 4 kids and one of them is a werewolf, and that became a show called Fang Face.
Right.
And,
Right.
Yeah.
See,
and
Paul,
so it was like
Fang Face.
Yeah,
Paul.
the geeky kid tries to eat the bully kid when he turns into a werewolf, so it was wacky. And then they went on, and they had a long history doing a lot of shows they generated themselves, such as they worked on Alvin and the Chipmunks, and then they did scores of 80s shows that sort of tied into popular trends like Supercade and Rubik the Amazing Cube, and then, of course, the Deathless Turbo Teen and a few other things. But anyway, they were up and running.
Yeah.
Unforgettable.
However, what we have to say of them, in the year we were there, they got 5 hours of shows on Saturday morning, which was unheard of, because remember, you only had 3 networks at that point. Right. And they had basically number 1 through 4 shows on there, and number 1 was the unforgettable Mr. T. Probably not due to our efforts, but nevertheless, it was in fact number 1. And they've done a show that was shockingly important that everybody forgets about, and that is Thundar. Before that,
Thundar,
which some combo play to Steve Gerber and Joe Ruby created that.
We were discussing earlier that there was sort of like a pioneer spirit at that time of artists and writers moving from New York who had made their careers there at Marvel and DC. They were coming out west to break into animation, and that also included Jack Kirby, the tremendous creator of Fantastic Four and Darkseid, and the New Gods and everything. And they found a second career here doing Saturday morning animation and writing it and creating it. I think there were some frustrations involved with the fact that at the time there were no Clone Wars, there was no Batman, there was no Gargoyles, there were none of the cooler shows that came along in the 90s in tone, and it was fairly standard Saturday morning stuff. So they had to work within a lot of restrictions they never would have had in comics. But I think they were all trailblazers, and they all set the stage for everything that was going to come.
Oh yeah, it was. I mean, if you want to know what the '80s stuff that we're talking about really was, it was when the comic book guys, because the animation was paying really well in relation to comics, and when the comic book guys moved out from New York and came to LA, and all of a sudden a bunch of comic book ideas like continuity and backstory and all that slammed into a bunch of animation ideas, and then syndication came, and we weren't under the strictures of network television. And that is what the engine, and I'll throw a little bit in just because I'm me and I have to, is a little bit of it was game. Is there, D&D players and stuff like that were also showing up on the creative teams, and they were worried about stuff like, what's our world? What are the rules of this world? That was probably one and only issue that I was pretty anal about. So there's one last thing about Joe and Ken that we don't want to forget is they were editors on my geek favorite show when I was a kid, and that was the Green Hornet. Okay, I'm like 10 years old, and they're Green Hornet editors, and it's like, wow, these guys worked on the Green Hornet. I mean, once again, this is all a baton that gets passed.
Now, I did not know that.
Yeah. And what's interesting is, and I don't know that they had a lot of other show credits, but that was their big one. It's like, wow, I'm talking to the guy who edited the Green Hornet. I mean, my introduction, I mean, we've already blown the punchline, but at one point Joe said we got free range development, which was a part of the season where we had two kinds of shows. We had the Golden Ashtray shows, what Joe called them, and they were shows where it was whatever the big license was that week, it was like Hot Video, Donkey Kong, Golden Ashtray. And then we had originals. And they're about 2 minutes in development season where you would do originals. So Joe grabbed me one day, he decided I was an action writer just because I looked like an action guy. I looked like something, didn't, strong safety for the Raiders or something at that point. And so he said, I want you to work with Joe and come up with some action ideas. And so I'm sitting down with this guy, Jack, and we immediately hit it off talking about ancients. I was an ancient history major in college, ancient mythology. I'm working for like a week and a half. And one day he says, when I created Captain America, and I realized, oh my God, Jack is Jack Kirby. Like, I mean, I was not a comic book guy like everybody else there, but I knew who Jack Kirby was. I had a normal amount of relationship with comic books when I was a kid. And it's like, if I'd known that when I started, I would have been too intimidated to talk to him.
How much of that conversation did you actually hear after he said, when I created Captain America, or did it all just like tone out in realization?
Well, my brain immediately turned into the Marvel, before Marvel movies, they run that trailer where all the comic book pages flip by. I realized exactly who I was talking to. That didn't change a thing because he was, we were doing a character based on Prometheus, and he was drawing it, but I realized, oh wow, this is a Marvel character. And somewhere Joe has that artwork. I know Joe Ruby has it somewhere. It's probably A, incredibly valuable, and B, I'd love to see it again.
That was one time Joe sent me to the art files to get something, and I was in there pouring through all these developments, like things that had been put in the works during the downtime, and there were incredible works of art by Jack Kirby. There was shows that had been pitched that had kind of gotten the networks, it's like they tapped them on the shoulder, but it's like, do we really want to take a chance with a Jack Kirby creation, or do we want to buy, the rights to Frogger? I mean, that's a hot video.
Oh yeah, you're always getting the Golden Ashtray, and Joe, because he created, Scooby-Doo, he wanted to create originals, and I mean, because Joe had a really pure, simple, genius idea about entertainment. I mean, it worked every time it was tried. It would get frustrating, for Steve and Buzz and all that. I mean, Buzz would have been doing stuff that would be on Cartoon Network now or something. But Joe was always trying, and I can only imagine what's sitting in his Indiana Jones locker, of like artwork.
Well, he actually had Jack come up with this great take on an Indiana Jones style adventure, and it was a woman. It was long before Lara Croft, and I remember looking at some of the artwork, and it was all period. It was like 30s and 40s, and it had a real pulp feel, and it just looked astonishing. And I do recall, I think Ken and Joe still have the rights to that, and they were trying to pitch it around as like a Kirby creation or something, because it really is it's amazing. Like about a year ago, I was over the Disney lot, and I was going through. They have this big outside courtyard where they have all the legends up. So it's people who've done legend. Of course, directors like Ward Kimball and the Disney Brothers, and people who've done voices for them over the years. And there, in the Shrine of Disney Legends, is Jack Kirby, because he's been enshrined with Stan Lee for the creation of the Marvel universe. And walking up to look at the plaque, I had this weird sort of flashback to sitting in the reception room at Ruby Spears talking to Jack and Roz Kirby about animation, and Jack saying something like, guy like me never make it over at Disney. I mean, they never even called me back when I sent my stuff over there. And it's like, at the time, 1982, of course, no comic books, no. But there he is, like a freaking a Disney legend, and it's like, great. It finally,
that's really.
He didn't even have to work for the company to get it. So.
Yeah, no, it's incredible. But so that was that era. So Marty, just died this week. Steve Gerber died a few years ago. Gordon Kent, died a couple of years ago. Jack Enyard. I mean, there's a high mortality rate, in those people, because they weren't that old. They were kind of a lot of them were beat older than us, but they went too soon. But so just framing it in the context of that's when all the stuff, probably don't remember any of these shows, and I don't think anybody is running to watch Pengo or Frogger, but yeah. That was where we all learned to do that stuff, and it's where we got together, and those free moments. I remember Paul and I we were working on our own action show, and I just remember we came up with a character called Ninjar. With an R on it, and that made total sense for an 80s character. I mean, I look at it now and I wince, but I mean,
we actually have 2 R's at the end. Ninja.
Yeah, 2 R's at the end of it. Then it was totally original. I forgot that.
We were always coming up with stuff and salting them away. Like, we got to do this someday. Let's do that.
Oh well, yeah. I mean, yeah. Well, and actually, too, this is a teaser, but we can't talk any more about it. But while I was cleaning out my own, my wife sent me over. We have a storage area, and she said, "We clean this out. We're paying, like $1,000 a year. Do you really want any of this stuff?" And what I opened up was this storage area we've had it for a number of years. We'd compressed it all, and it basically was just what it almost looks like. I emptied out my office at Sunbow and at Dungeons and Dragons, somewhere in the mid-'80s, threw it into a box, and it's just sitting in there. And I found a thing Paul and I did in like 1986 that we reread it and we said, we're bringing this back. I mean, think of this. These are 2 guys doing something in the day at the height of our powers, doing this stuff that, we thought was really funny. And then you look at it 30 years later and, this guy.
Because it was of the moment. It was while we were developing all those shows that have gone on to be classics. And here's one that just, never made it for whatever reason. And
I think part of the reason was we never presented it to anybody because we would have been executed, but it would be really good.
Yes, there is that.
Yeah, I think there would have been consequences if we'd let anybody see, because it was sort of, we were a little bit finally at a fairly cynical point. I think you were still Lucasfilm, and I was at, as a matter of fact, I know you were Lucasfilm.
Yeah, because we were back and forth.
I was at Sunbow.
Through the mail.
Yes, it was by the mail, because of mail. And you had for me your Lucasfilm stationery as a cover letter.
Yeah, that's right.
So that that was the thing, and that was a period too where it was this magical time, and this is just something to sort of know and just deep geek stuff, because we're talking here for a while. Is it was the exact moment when everybody was shifting over from typing on a typewriter, like an IBM Selectric and a word processor. And the more affluent writers had their word processors, and everybody at Ruby Spears used that Xerox model and Xerox word processors. I had my Mac, word processor, digital equipment company, but we still had a typist room there, and we had script typers, and it was like something. It was probably the last moment when they existed in the entertainment business. They're an artifact of television from the 50s and 60s, and and still there. But they were there, and they would actually do different color pages. And a lot of them went on to have very interesting writing careers. I mean, Katie Cooch and Cheryl Scarborough.
Cheryl Scarborough is a novelist now.
Yeah, she's a novelist. She's done a ton of stuff, and she wrote a lot of shows after that. Meg McLaughlin wrote some of the more interesting Transformer episodes and stuff like that. But they were like typists at the time, but our attitude was, and the place also kind of looked like a modeling agent. We're not supposed to talk about that. But anyway, so it was
but typing the stuff up, they were going like, oh, I could write this crap.
Yeah,
write better too.
Oh, they get paid to write this crap. I can do this. And the truth is they could. No, in fairness to everybody concerned, they were an extraordinarily talented group of people. They were grossly overqualified to be doing what they were doing, and it showed later on.
Yeah.
But so that was the world. So it was a little bit the old world and a little bit the new world. Right in the middle of that period, arcade games were out, and and we go out for lunch and wherever, with a lot of quarters and do that. I mean, arcades were at their peak, but the first home games were coming out. Right in that period, I met Gary Gygax, and he said, "You got to see this." And he took me over, and this was in his house in Wisconsin. Took me over and showed me a pre-release version of the Nintendo Dungeons and Dragons game.
Right.
That was one of the usual. Did you write episodes for Dungeons and Dragons show?
I did. I wrote.
I thought
one, which was beautifully animated by TMS, and it turned out to be really a tremendous looking episode. Then I wrote another one, and then somebody kind of rewrote it. It was weird. Like I had written like a first draft, and I kind of liked it. And then I think they had new directors or new story editors coming on, so it's like, we'll take this. And then they did I never got a note on it, because then they just rewrote it all in house, and so it was put out as a second one. But that first one I thought was, it turned out pretty good.
Did you guys see the live action Dungeons and Dragons? It was I think it's an Italian car commercial, but they did a live action version of it.
Yeah, it looked really good. Was that a show?
I don't remember what it was for specifically, which means it wasn't a very good ad, because I don't remember what the product was they were selling.
Well, they were selling dragons, because the car business has changed a little bit. They got into a lot of biotech, and so they're doing giant dragons now.
Yeah, it has nothing to do with performance anymore. It's about like if your car can drive itself,
Right.
They did a Wacky Races one where they built all the cars, like real life versions of those crazy cars, and with live actors. And I think it might have been the same company. I don't know, but it was the same tone.
It was really well done. So Flint, something is that you talked about or mentioned. I've mentioned before about Gen X is, we are this generation that is halfway in the analog world and half in the digital world. And we saw that switch over. And that's kind of a fascinating place to be from the standpoint of a generation. And, I'm kind of the middle to tail end of Gen X. My brother, people who are in their 50s, are sort of the front end. But, we went from basically using typewriters. I remember typing some of my homework and stuff on a typewriter to getting our first home computer.
Yeah,
which was a black screen with a green blinking cursor. I mean, this is way before the graphics interface, which was largely stolen from Xerox by Apple.
Xerox PARC.
But yeah, exactly. But it's an interesting generation in the sense that we do have one foot kind of in this old west, and we saw this transition over to this new digital world, and we really are sort of the guinea pigs for a lot of this tech, because we're the first to really get our hands on it. But it's sort of an interesting perspective to have, because and it's something that I noticed the other day when I was at the park. I'm doing my regular dog walk at the park. And it's just flooded with people, and nobody's on a device. not one person is on a device because they get that at home and they've been stuck at home for the last 45 days. So it's like, let's get
Right.
outside, let's get some fresh air and to do a little digital detox. So I'm looking around and people are playing catch, they're throwing the football, they're having a picnic, they're doing all this analog stuff.
Yep.
And there's no digital tech to be found. And I was like, what decade am I in right now? And this is wonderful. I mean, this is a wonderful thing. People are actually getting to experience life without this stuff.
Brilliant observation, because I think we're heading to an outdoor culture for a little while. And I think we're, people been, we're notice where we are right now, but people are kind of zoomed out, and the sheer joy. That's the one thing I've done all the way through this is work out at my local park, and sheer joy of throwing a football. I've been throwing regulation size, not the mini footballs that Garcetti, has allowed, but it's much more dangerous for, spreading virus, but sheer joy of it. And everybody's out there doing stuff, pure analog. I hadn't really thought about it that way. You're right. Nobody's on their phone.
It's a beautiful thing.
It is absolutely beautiful. And I think for a while, we're gonna find ourselves in a world where we just want to be out there.
Well, one of the things when you're not on your phone, you can daydream. And you can just kind of let your thoughts drift. And I miss the days where people were just standing on a street corner thinking, not doing it. There's no reason to be plugged in all the time. It's just not necessary. And the Gen Xers remember the days when you would just kind of stare off into nothingness and just think and daydream and get lost in creativity and imagination. That has been lost with Gen Y and Gen Z, and I've told people, hey, look, if you're having trouble adapting to social isolation, talk to a Gen Xer, because we were also the latchkey kids. We were the first. Our parents basically invented divorce in the 70s, so we were the first kids to kind of come home. Nobody's there. Maybe your older brother or your sister was there, but we were the least parented and the least nurtured generation, probably of the last 40 or 50 years. So, we come home and, my usual day was come home, rummage for some snacks in the pantry, do my homework while G.I. Joe is on or Transformers is on, and you're kind of self-sufficient. And then the parents come home later after work. So, I keep telling people, look, if you're having trouble, with this social isolation, with the lockdown, talk to a Gen Xer, because, we really were able to navigate our way through kind of that world.
Right.
And, a lot of people are having trouble with it these days, but it's an interesting kind of perspective that I think only our generation really has at this point.
Yeah, I remember when I grew up, and I'm the same generation as Flint, that it was technology was something that existed on, Walt Disney show when he would show you Tomorrowland. This is coming someday, but no day soon. So when I would come home, I would, after school, I'd just throw my books down and yell to my mom, "Go to the creek." She goes, "Okay, be home by 6. Oh, and that hobo's back. Stay out from under the bridge. All right." And really, there, I grew up in the East Bay, near over the hill from Berkeley, where you went to college, and it was pretty rural out there, and there was the water treatment plant owned a lot of woods and forest and the creek that went through there. And they were always chasing us off the property, but I don't care. And we went down there and we'd go swimming in the creek, and we'd, look at animals, and we'd climb trees and just sit there for a while. And we would talk to the hobo from a safe distance and, watch possums, whatever. And then we come home, and where were you now? I was at the creek. Okay, take a bath. Because get the ticks off you.
Yeah. Trust me, the Zoomer sitting behind me here, my son never had. Hey, go on out, and we'll see you when the sun goes down.
That was my family's rule, was be home before dark.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. Or when you hear the dinner bell. Yeah. And you'd start hearing this wave of dinner bells, and like kids would be peeling off, and it was terrible. I mean, I grew up, in your sort of classic suburb. I mean, it could have been Riverdale. I mean, it basically literally is a town that divided at the tracks. We had a farm at the edge of our neighborhood, But in the winter, when the trees, it was the suburb of Chicago, when the trees were, didn't have leaves, I could see the tallest building in the world on the horizon. I mean, so it wasn't exactly urban and it wasn't exactly rural. It was just, it's kind of this weird mix between the two. And it was a total
that was
childhood. And because we were a generation where we were the first generation where people had kids without any hope of economic gain. In other words, every other generation, you have kids because they're extremely high-end farm animals, right? That would help you out on the farm, and then they were your social security program, or they, they were your apprentice blacksmith, and they would keep the blacksmith shop going when you were too old to do it, or whatever. Well, all of a sudden, after World War II, we had no purpose. You know what I mean? And we had really no purpose. That's how you explain boomers. And the first generation of boomers are basically all of our prominent politicians for the last generation. I mean, everybody from Bill Clinton to Donald Trump to Hillary Clinton, to were born in 1946, literally in 1946, first year of the baby boom, right?
Right.
Everybody came back from the war and had a kid, and that's who's been leading our country. I'm 10 years later, and Paul's about the same as I am. Paul, you're like a year younger than I am, or 2 years younger?
Yeah, about 2 years younger. Yeah.
But it's basically the same thing. And that I was born the same year as Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, because when we opened our eyes into the real world, all the older boomers had clogged up all the normal positions. They were directing all the movies and doing all that, so we had to do a new technology. So we're this weird thing. Like I remember in '78 going to Silicon Valley to the San Jose, computer expo or something like that. And if you went there the right year, I mean, the year I went there, you would have the real Steve Jobs trying to sell you an Apple, the real Bill Gates behind the Microsoft counter. They were all there. And I remember buying a record of computer generated music, and that was like pure magic and all that. And, and I started, that's why, I mean, I saw my first video games, and okay, I know what my future is, but I have no idea how to design games. Right. I mean, no, you could go to film school. I went to film school, but I didn't know how to go to game school. They didn't have games at the school. Right. I now teach at a game school at times.
I knew the 21st century was on its way when you came into Ruby Spears that day with a Macintosh in your, like the portable Macintosh, which was about the size of a safe that you put in a padded backpack, and you brought it in, and it's like, there's the future, boys, and you brought it out, and it's like, whoa, it was.
Oh, well, I got it. Yeah, a friend of mine.
Stones that brought fire out for us.
Yeah, like it fallen off a truck. Apparently, I have no idea what, because you couldn't get one. They were really like hot sellers.
Yeah.
A friend of mine said, "Hey, you got $3,000? I'll buy this." And that was the point. We were just being paid silly money, and I was still living like a college student. I mean, I had been a Hollywood gorilla for 5 years, so I had no expenses. And $3,000, that's nothing. And he went and bought it. It didn't do anything. Remember, we took that up to Lucasfilm, and what a turd that thing was. But nevertheless,
well, we practically had to strap it on the front of the car like a.
No, absolutely. But it felt so sleek at the time. I mean, that was like, you actually carry your computer, because everybody else had these things that were like the size of the monolith in 2001. We had these. It felt sleek to have this unit you could just carry around. But that's the way to think about that era. Is there were new miracles falling out of the world every day. Right. Some new machine you could play video games on by hand. They were just like, all this stuff was popping, and it wasn't wired. Okay. It didn't connect to anything else in the universe, and
that was like at Lucasfilm, I remember they had a new experimental system that George was really interested in. I think he actually funded, called Edit Droid, and it was editing on laser discs, and it was pretty impressive, but the time it took a lot of time to make the edits. You could see where it was going, though, and then about 5 years later it became Avid,
right?
And then but it was really interesting watching the formation of technology at that time, especially by guys like Lucas and Steve Jobs, who could put a lot of money into things, and you knew that this was going to fall out along the wayside, but it needed to get done so you could have the sleeker version 5 to 7 years later. When I was working up there, George just put a lot of money into a small company called Pixar, and I would go over and watch them, and they were actually part of Lucasfilm, part of ILM at the time. And I would go over there, and Steve Lasseter and his guys are there, and they're animating triangles and blobs
Right.
and little forms, like here are 3 blobs and it's a bee, you know. And I would sit there for hours watching them move this stuff around, and I thought, it's like watching, you know, Steamboat Willie or something. At some point it's going to be
So you
great.
knew when you saw it that you were seeing the future.
I actually said, this is your Steamboat Willie to
Yeah,
those
wow.
guys. And they knew it too. They just, because they had a lot of really great, here's the thing about Pixar at that time, was they had a lot of conceptual artwork that they had done by hand that was really dripping with emotion. That they did a short called Red's Dream, which is about a little unicycle sitting in a dusty part of a bike shop, and it dreams about being a circus performer, and then it cuts back, and you know, he'll never be anything but that. So you know, but it ignored little unicycle, and yet the emotion was in the drawing, and I could see that's where they were going for, was the synthesis of visual and emotion. And I thought, this is going to go somewhere. It's not just guys going the technical razzle dazzle of what we can do. It was more like, how do we take these blobs and curves and shapes and balls and get out emotion out of that? And it all came from visual, nonverbal emotion. And I thought, these guys are on exactly the right course, because it's like they're dealing in silent cartoons again. How do you get the emotion out of that? Right. And I thought, it's just a matter of time and money and support, and this is really gonna go someplace. I never thought specifically they were going to do Brave or Toy Story or Cars or anything, but you know, it was all there.
I remember seeing that on a Spike and Mike's film festival at like a dollar theater on the west side of town. It was the only place that was showing this thing, and I remember watching this, which is, you know, most of it, 95% of it's all 2D, and there's this one short which looks kind of like Tron, kind of like Last Starfighter. I'm seeing something that's obviously computer generated, and there wasn't a whole lot of it at that time, but visually I knew this is something really interesting. And it's like you were saying, so much of that, the emotion, you know, how to get all that stuff to emote was pulled from 2D. So much of those principles and those fundamentals, and you know, I'm an animation major, so it was and even though, you know, it was computer animation, we started out on 2D doing pencil tests, and you know, and we were always encouraged, you know, you've got to take these fundamentals out of 2D and put them into the 3D. Otherwise, it's just not going to work. There's not going to be an emotion. There's not going to be anything in there that's going to make it look authentic to anyone. It's just going to kind of look sleek and slick and sort of boring. Right. But that was one of the things that you know, and it's something that I still think is fundamental to 3D is those 2D kind of traditions. You know, it's the only way that makes 3D really work.
Yeah, I mean, as long as you've got that fusion of heart, story, and actually, I'll say music, you know, you're going to have great animation, because those are all the things that work on a almost subliminal level that involve you in something. Dialogue is great to move things around, but as long as you've got those other core elements, you can really tell any kind of good story.
Well, it's the same with rotoscoping. Even all of the heavy rotoscoping that Masters of the Universe did, that Lou Shire did. You know, when you go back and you look at that stuff frame by frame, you can see the squash and the stretch, and they really are exaggerating the same way that you would if you were just doing it without any rotoscoping. Because, you know, when it is just traced from rotoscoping, it's very stiff and kind of lifeless in a lot of ways. So, you know, all that great exaggeration really brings it to life in a lot of ways.
Yeah, you need really, as you know, you need really superbly well-trained animators to give it, and directors to plot out and give it that sort of life. And they really do have to be actors with pencils, like Chuck Jones says, in order to give it, to infuse it with that movement. When you're doing like you said, like a Filmation show that was rotoscoped, if you have to move Flash Gordon or Tarzan or the Lone Ranger from one scene to one scene, you have the stock books, you trace out the character, and you just change the details on, you know, their costume and everything. And you have, okay, here's movement, here's a big guy running, and here's a tiger jumping or something like that. And it made it go a lot faster, and it was very cost effective. But again, you know, it is what it is. It's scaled down to be, you know, fast entertainment.
Did you guys see the Power of Grayskull documentary on Netflix?
I've seen
Is that one that was
I don't
done
think so.
years ago? Like that, like guys are arguing about who created. Wait, I created Vorlash, the magic.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
there's the Toys That Made Us episode, which
Yes,
deals
saw
with,
that.
and that was good. But there is like a hour and a half long documentary on the creation of it, and it was produced by Adam Goldberg, who does the Goldbergs.
Yeah.
And funny enough, Adam and I are exactly the same age, so it's no wonder I love that show, and I was just kind of enthralled by this documentary. But and actually, it had a couple of my buddies in it, Val Staples and Emiliano Santalucia, and a couple other people that I know. But it was really fascinating, not only to see kind of how that show came about, but also how the FCC was heavily regulating toy commercials back then. And then in like the once Reagan got into office, like 80, basically those FCC regulations were set to, they needed a signature in order to continue on, and they were
Yeah.
they were allowed to lapse. They basically said, we're just going to let the free market decide. And this idea that you can only have 5 or 10 seconds of animation within a toy commercial, it's ridiculous. So we're just going to let it lapse, let it go, and that's what gave way to
That's
the 22-minute episode, because Lou was originally approached by Mattel to do a 2-hour or an hour and a half special on He-Man, and Lou's sitting there thinking to himself, okay, well, that's great, but for a little bit more money, if you spend a little bit more money, I can produce you a year's worth of episodes, and if I can do a year's worth of episodes, if I can do, 66 episodes or whatever, I can keep my entire staff employed year round, which I thought was just brilliant. Because that's kind of the animation industry to a large degree. Is you get a project, you work on it, it's over, and that studio will dissolve. That happened with Space Jam. I mean, they built that huge state-of-the-art studio and hired all these great artists for Space Jam. It makes all this money, and it's kind of like, hey, why don't we go do this again? No, we're just going to lay everybody off because we don't have another project set. So I mean,
well, you touch on a lot of really interesting points here. I mean, we can just spend an hour talking about dissecting what you said, and then go off on different tangents. I mean, I think to the heart of what you said about shows that were tied into merchandise, that goes back all the way to 1969 when advertising was actually part of the show, and even before then, you'd be watching a show, you'd be watching Bullwinkle, let's say, and there on would come an ad for Cheerios, hosted by Rocky and Bullwinkle. The whole reason Hanna-Barbera got a start to begin with was you had Huckleberry Hound. He does the cartoons, but he's sponsored by Kellogg's. So Huck's in the ads, he's eating the cereal, and you can send away for Huckleberry Hound toys. And this was a trend that continued to about 69.
He did Sugar Smacks, right? Quick
Draw McGraw. Yeah, he was Sugar Smacks.
Sugar Smacks. And who was the critter with the crispy the
Linus Lionheart
chocolate ones, not Count Chocula. There were the other like chocolate cereal. I mean, yeah, because those cereals, they were indistinguishable from the Hanna-Barbera cartoons. There
was Snagglepuss who did Cocoa Krispies.
Right.
Snagglepuss was the mountain lion who.
What kind of animal was Snagglepuss?
What?
What kind of animal was Snagglepuss?
He was called the mountain lion. I mean, they kind of futzed it. He's just sort of an all-purpose lion, but I think originally when he started on Quick Draw McGraw, he was a mountain lion. He was actually an adversary, and he had the same voice. He was colored orange rather than pink, and they just spun him off into like Yogi Bear's world. So he was a mountain lion that lived up in there.
By the way, Paul, next time we do one of these, you got to do it from your office so they can see all your stuffed, taxidermical heads.
Oh yeah,
he literally went to Tasmania to try to find a Tasmanian wolf. Okay, he really did this, and he got chased off the end of a dock by a Komodo dragon. All this stuff happened to Paul.
That's my Commander McBragg adventure, so we can talk about at some point.
That Power Grayskull doc is worth checking out. I think both you guys would find it pretty fascinating.
I think I have seen it. I mean, all I took away with it, because I knew some of those guys, was all these guys bickering over, who'd created Spanklord. It's like,
it's like three. There's like three main guys that created He-Man. And it was all of their efforts combined, from the standpoint of the original idea to the design. and just kind of the implementation. So, and they do kind of bicker over who gets credit, and
who were they? Who were the three guys? I'm trying to remember. Joe Straczynski, one of them, or who were they?
Oh gosh,
Joe came along later to do the shows.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
He came up after the show was up and running.
Oh, here's a story I've never told anybody. Okay, so my first meeting ever in the animation business, which preceded working at Ruby Spears by a couple of years, was with Lou Scheimer because he wanted to license Buck Rogers.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad called me up and said, "Hey, we go take this meeting." Okay. And because he didn't want to drive down from Carmel to take a meeting, so I went in and took the meeting, and I'm talking to him, and they knew I was in film school, and it was Lou and his daughter. I'm trying to remember her name. Erica. Yes, they were in the meeting, and they brought in Arthur Nadell, and Lou showed me in Masters of the Universe when they were just toys, and they were like. It was kind of the 5 good guy, 5 bad guy, except I think there were and 2 vehicles model that would become all toy shows later on. This is I don't even think I was maybe I just started in film school. I mean, it was early on in my time in LA. It had to be like 79, maybe 80. And so they showed me Master of the Universe and said, "Hey, if you come up with some ideas for this." So I went and wrote what years later I would discover is a TV development. Wow. Yeah, I just poured my heart into it, wrote it, and all that. And the way I had it figured is, well, you got the arch enemies are the 2 guys that have the most opposite powers. You have the sea guy who can sort of fly, and the sky guy. I treated it very much like a game. And he wrote these developments and didn't hear anything. And finally, Arthur Nadell, called up and said, "No, this isn't what we're looking for." That was it. That was the end of my animation career right then and there. And I would love to find that document somewhere. Because little did I know I'd be in a pitched battle with these guys at Ruby Spears in 2 years, and then at Sunbow later on. But yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, Erica's in that doc. She seems like an interesting lady.
Great. Yeah,
I was amazed at how many women writers, directors, and artists were working on Masters at the time, and I guess that was something that was sort of unusual.
Bryn Stevens wrote a bunch of those, and,
right? But Lou seemed there's also some really interesting old interviews with Lou in that doc, and he just seemed like such an interesting and sweet guy.
Yes, he was.
And it's Masters for me. I mean, I my parents bought me all of those first generation Masters, and I remember getting the little mini comics inside the blister packs, which were done by I think a bunch of DC guys, and Bruce Timm did some of the.
That was his first comic book stuff, I believe, was those little mini comics. Yeah,
and those were really cool. However, it was really the cartoon which launched it and made it so much bigger for all of us as consumers, as young boys. That's what really made this world believable and something that you wanted to escape to every single day. And that was the same with Transformers and G.I. Joe. It was so much of an escape. And frankly, it was the best part of the day for me and my friends at school, because that was largely all we talked about, all we played. We'd either be playing G.I. Joe or Transformers on the playground during recess. And then we go home and you kind of blast through your homework and then, get to the most important part of the day, which is watching these cartoons. And it was just such a special time, especially to be a boy during that era. And it's and I just think that, I say to myself, it'd be so great. Sometimes I use the hashtag a lot, Make America 80s Again, because I absolutely love that decade, and I'd love to be able to see those kind of cartoons happen, but I just don't know if that's really possible at this point. I think that was for that specific period in time, and I don't know if it could necessarily be replicated again. But there was so much magic during that era.
I certainly want to take a shot at it. Obviously we don't know whether it can be replicated, but I want to take a shot at it because there's something. I have this feeling that we're not supposed to talk about anything past 95, so I won't dwell on it. But I have this feeling that right now, we've gone through this period where everything is dark and everything is nasty, and right now, I mean, I had this epiphany. You know, I was talking to Chris Metzen, who's the guy who was behind Diablo and the World of Warcraft and StarCraft. So and both of us, I mean, we did Diablo together, and we did a whole Transformer graphic novel series together, and we've been very definitely in Dark World, and both of us have come to this conclusion that what was so joyous about those shows, and I realize we kind of wrecked it, it's a different conversation, but was you knew in those days that nothing really bad was going to happen. Game of Thrones has now hit design exhaustion of get you to really like a character and kill him.
Yep.
I think people want to go back to just, because we've actually had a pretty menacing, threatening, traumatic period. Just where you turn on a show and nobody's going to die in the show. Your guys, he's going to fall down a deep pit, but then the next episode he's going to be crawling out, cursing the guy, trying to figure out how he's going to get revenge. And it's a softer, more fun kind of entertainment, because I want to do things. The next thing I do in this kind of animation, I want it to be something where nobody dies.
Yeah.
Okay? Because once you take that off the table, then you take back the guilt, you take all the bad emotion out of it, and it's just fun. The real world's been scary enough.
I mean, you want an escape. You want an escape, and that's something that you guys provided to me and all of my friends. And that is something that I've thought about. I've been, thinking about this ever since 2016. I started to move out of production and into managing, and I became a book packager and largely packaging graphic novels. And I've been trying to figure out, and I've been thinking about this a lot, what was the magic from that era that made all that stuff so commercial? Because you guys were able to hit this huge swath of a demo. Unlike probably any other decade where you were really, really hitting everybody right here, here and here. But that's the element of the 80s that I think is missing today is sincerity, heart, and sweetness and hope. And I recently started watching old 80s sitcoms. I started with Family Ties because that was something that we all watched as a family. Every week, that was must-see TV. And we all sit down after dinner and you watch this stuff as a family on the one TV that you had in the house. Maybe you were rich and you had two TVs, but that's something.
Retired down in the basement. It's black and white.
Right. We had one of those too. That's so funny. We had a black and white in the basement. The color was upstairs, with the VCR, which was also that was a big purchase back then. That's probably about $1,200 back then.
Yeah.
But I find myself looking back at those shows and seeing kind of this unifying theory throughout them, and that is everything is hopeful, everything is very sincere, and today we have replaced sincerity with snark. And the snark has completely and totally destroyed the potential for hope.
That's why I don't watch more. People say, "What do you think of animated movies, animated features?" And with very few exceptions, I'll watch the Disney stuff. Because I think that they ultimately have heart in the right place, where they can mix a little cynicism but still give you a happy ending at the end. Anybody else, I won't touch them because it's snark, snark, snark. The characters are all standing like this, back to back, with the attitude, and it's snark, snark, snark.
Oh, it's a CG character.
It's lines that I saw 2.5. They're quoting lines that I saw 2.5 years ago as lame catchphrases on SNL that now they've recycled as. I don't really want to get into it, but it's like it's a little too.
No,
it's flipped, but kind of pointless.
Yeah. I mean, let me ask you guys though. I mean, when you guys were writing all this stuff back in the 80s, I mean, were you conscious of the fact that you were writing stuff that was very commercial, that was hitting a huge swath of young boys? I mean, was that in your mind? Was that the modus operandi behind your bosses? Were they saying, "Hey, you got to keep this"?
I'll kick this off. I knew that the shows would be popular because, and this is being a little cynical myself, a lot of times those shows that you mentioned were supported by large campaigns. The money came from toy companies to put those shows on the air, and that would be promoting it, and that there was a lot of stuff out there for boys and girls, because you had like Gem and the Holograms and My Little Pony and things like that. So yes, you can't deny that the shows really did support the toy lines, but a good show is a good show, and we put a lot of attention into writing them, into world building on those shows, as Flint will attest on GI Joe and Transformers, to create a modern mythology that people really embrace the same way they embraced Stan Lee's and Jack Kirby's Marvel comics and DC comics. It really did become part of the cultural language. And you have generations of cartoonists, boys and girls, now growing up, looking back at, I loved Jem. I loved My Little Pony. I loved, the Disney afternoon at that time too. All the DuckTales and things.
Right.
And it really did provide a formative background at the time. And I think as we were writing on it, we thought, we have a chance to make this stuff really fun, and to really write some good stuff. And yeah, at the end of the day, we're tying into a program to support a toy and everything. There's no reason why we can't do it the best we can, or draw, in the cases of guys like Steve Gerber, Marty Pasko, and many of the others, draw on the same tone that we have in comic books, and that sense of character development, and bring it to these creations.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what made them resonate.
Interesting. I find a lot of the pop culture of that era very hopeful. And as the 80s started to wind down, I started to move. I'm growing up. I'm getting into my early teenage years, and I started to move away from all that stuff and started to go kind of more in the direction of heavy metal and Mad Max and the Road Warrior, and more kind of serious stuff and film. And then Paul, you basically kind of hooked me again with Batman the Animated Series. Not to say that Inhumanoids was like super dark and really creepy and weird, but not dark enough to turn guys my age off. We love that stuff because it was so sort of radical at the time.
Well, that's sort of reflective of like young development. I mean, you go from things that are kids always want to reach up a bit. So
Right.
You might have a smaller kid who a parent might say, "Oh, GI Joe's not age appropriate for my 7 or 8-year-old boy," but they want to reach up for that. And then when you get to be about 12 or 13, you want heavy metal music. You want to make that next step.
Yeah.
You want to kind of strive up. And it's the same with literature. You want to read more interesting things, more adult things. You want to put things, not necessarily leave them behind, but put them on hold for a while. And then you go off, you explore the world, physics and geography, and everything else that you do. And then you kind of come back to the things, to your home base, to the things you really loved. And I think that's really where your heart is. Try everything,
Yeah, Flint, I want to tell you, seeing, I know you get a lot of flack for killing Optimus Prime. And I just want to tell you that I was not traumatized by it, because I had been prepared because of the death of Roy Fokker. So I was a big Robotech fan, and especially the Macross saga. And Roy Fokker was, funny enough, my favorite character. He was, the big, tall, blonde, super tan. He was Skull Leader, and he was also in this, he was dating a black girl, which was something that I had never seen before, but just made sense. Pretty black girl, pretty white girl, who cares, right? Sexy girl. But like, that was the first, my first experience outside of film where a main character was literally killed fairly early in the season. I mean, that's about a quarter of the way into the season, and they kill him off in a pretty dramatic way. And the original broadcast version that they showed, which they later edited, showed him collapse on the floor with 3 bullet holes in his back, and there's blood. And so it was like, I'm going into the theater for Transformers, and I keep hearing from all of my friends that there's this rumor that they're going to kill Optimus Prime. And, in the first 30 seconds, you see a lot of guys go down, Ironhide and Prowl and a lot of dudes. And I was just kind of like, what is going on here? Like seriously, what is going on? And then all of a sudden, you got that great scene of Prime on his deathbed going gray, and then Daniel just crying his eyes out. And I was just thinking to myself, yeah, and I was sad. I was definitely bummed at the time. But at the same time, I also knew the methods of comics and also movies and TV, which is they're more than likely going to bring this guy back at some point in time. I mean, it's the character and the voice, everything. It's just way too cool. and I knew within probably the next season he would be back, which obviously they did. The Zombie Prime, and then they finally brought him back. But just to give you some refreshing news, I was not traumatized. You did not ruin my childhood. You actually made it fantastic.
What's funny about, and I talk about all that stuff a lot in the book, so I won't step on that. But I mean, in answer to your earlier question, where and it kind of gets to responding to what you just said. I mean, when I worked for Sunbow, I was a producer on the shows, and I was story editor, and I did all the things normal showrunner would do. But what I really was an ad executive. I mean, Sunbow was the production arm of Griffin Bacall,
right?
Which that exact moment was the fastest growing ad agency in Madison Avenue. And when I'd go back to New York, it's like, because I was rewriting the Transformer movie, and I went back there a lot for Toy Fair and a bunch of other reasons. In the afternoon, when I was like written out, then they called me into ad meetings, and we'd be writing, commercials and taglines. And I had a great time doing that. That was fun.
Yeah.
And we knew, but the part of it was we knew the audience was, I mean, I was writing, you can only really write for one person. I mean, tell me if you agree with this, Paul. And you're ultimately, at the end of the day, you're always writing for yourself.
Yeah.
I was writing to write the show I always wanted to watch, right?
Yeah.
And you can use all sorts of sophisticated arguments and have all sorts of, really adult sounding explanations. But at the end of the day, that's what you're doing. That having been said, what I was very well aware of was not only it was kids coming home, but it was another phenomenon of that period. And that was, because when I got brought on to Transformers, it was because Transformers was not doing as well as they wanted it to against a show called GoBots. And they moved me over from G.I. Joe to Transformers. And it was during a recession. And what I knew is, and think about that in the context of right now, there were a lot of dads who were at home. And I wanted to be the show Dad would not be embarrassed watching with his kids. Mm-hmm. Okay. Nice. And you see that now at conventions where you got, it's now a generational franchise. And what were Mom and Dad then are now Grandma and Grandpa.
Right.
And the kid is now Dad. And now you got the grandkids showing up for this stuff. And so that was what made us a little bit different. It wasn't like it was more adult in any dirty way or violent way. It was more adult in we had jokes that we didn't mind, which, let's be honest, the Termite Terrace guys were doing this in the 30s and 40s, that were kind of over the head of the kids. We didn't care because that was sort of winking to Dad that, like, this is okay to watch this. There's something in here for you too. There's a lot of political content. I mean, if you watch, in Humanoids, one level it's H.P. Lovecraft. At another level, it's it's my Facebook page, and at another level, it's a comedy. I mean, just ridiculous. When you make Phil Donahue, Phil Donahue into Granahue,
that was perfect. That was so awesome.
I mean, you're doing that, and I realized with that you could layer all that stuff on top of each other, and it came to a very unique brew. I mean, in Humanoids, there's a show I have unfinished business with. That's it. And probably if there's one where I look back and I go, wow, this was our best animation and our best day, and it was the end, it was the Visionaries, which is very hard to see nowadays.
Yeah, that was the tail end for me when I started to kind of grow up and started to grow out of toys was around the time Visionaries was sort of kind of in the middle of that for some reason. And then I remember they launched the Marvel comic with it too, and I was picking that up. But it was just sort of that transition where you just start to grow up and sort of grow out of that stuff. And instead of playing with those toys, you put them up on your shelf. They become sort of display, and you're still proud of them.
Metaphorically, that was kind of happening, and we're kind of hitting time, and we could open the door to a whole new topic, but it may be its own show because we really most of what we talked about, we haven't gotten past 1983 yet. I mean, we didn't do it. We did only glanced on Sunbow.
I think we're going to push the show a little bit longer. If for no other reason, I received a text message that wishes to remain anonymous that says, "If you don't let them talk about GI Joes, we're going to have a problem." So. In effort to stay on that person's good side, I'm gonna.
I did watch the movie recently, and I haven't seen it since probably the late '80s, and I was just blown away at how good it is. Not only the animation, Toei just did a beautiful work on that, but also I remember, is it who does Serpentor throw the the snake, kind of like Conan, James Earl Jones with the snake, throws the spear and it goes into the chest. Is that Hawk, as I recall? And there's blood. There's like a little bit of blood that spurts out. I was blown away by that, and then also, over and over again. I was once a man. I mean, that just killed me.
Okay, now the truth is, you have to get Buzz Dixon on to talk about the G.I. Joe movie.
Yeah.
Buzz and next time we'll throw an extra person. We'll get Buzz in there because Buzz went along all this entire ride with all of us, and he stayed on G.I. Joe long after I did because I've been moved over to Transformers.
Gotcha.
Okay, because I'm really season 1 and into season 2, and I would still story edit scripts, when we got, because we were doing 65 half hours a year of G.I. Joe and of Transformers and of all the other stuff we were doing, and we really only had, well, I don't know, 5 story editors at the company, and then Jay Bacall, who's like a super person, who was our he was the guy at Sunbow. He was Joe Bacall's son. And so we were constantly being flipped back and forth between shows. So let's get Buzz on to talk about the G.I. Joe. I can speak long and far about and hard about the first season of G.I. Joe. And I wrote episodes for the second season because usually I'd only write one when it had fallen out. Usually I was so busy editing and producing the stuff that, it was only when somebody would, deliver something that was just unworkable that I get this call, hey, why don't you, we need a script in 48 hours. And that's what the Games Master was. That's what Oda Cobra was. And I mean, they were written incredibly fast, and I'm extremely happy with what came out. The Skeletons in the Closet, all of them were written on extreme deadlines. But at that point, I probably edited 60 episodes of the show, so it's like I knew everything intuitively.
Right.
See, I'm more interested about season 1 of G.I. Joe, just because that's kind of what I see as like a Pulp Fiction Cineverse, where it's like, as I got older, I would constantly see an international team of heroes brought together to fight whoever.
Yeah.
And I always kind of called that G.I. Joe. And then I got older and I'm like, is G.I. Joe just 7 samurai with laser guns? And season 1 of G.I. Joe to me is really kind of an exploratory thing that was big and powerful. And that kind of interests me more. I'd love to hear about season 1, like what the thoughts were behind that.
As I said, I mean, I think that ought to be another topic. What I've been getting pinged because I was going to pay off. I thought we were going to be done in an hour, so he'd schedule.
If you guys are willing to come back and do an entire season show dedicated to G.I. Joe, we're going to do that. I'll save that for another show.
But
because I was involved early on. Like, the show was offered to me early on, and I remember flying to New York with Steve Gerber. We had this whole trip there to go and talk to Jay Bacall and pitch a take on the series, and I came away with my first episode to write on that. But I also had another offer kind of snapping at my heels around the same time, and I decided, well, I'm going to go off and do that. I mean,
that was you and I going to Lucasfilm, right?
That was Lucasfilm. Which is another trip. Which is another hours.
We're not
trip up to Lucasfilm
yet. We're nowhere near G.I. Joe yet in this conversation, and
we're miles away from Skywalker Ranch. But I mean,
well, then we'll pause G.I. Joe and bring you guys back for another one completely on that.
Just so everybody knows, Tubi right now has all of the seasons of G.I. Joe you can watch for free. And I started out on season 1 probably about 3 weeks ago, and they did this during the lockdown. They made it. They put it on Tubi for free, so you can watch. Wow. You can watch everything. And I went back and started rewatching it just because I hadn't seen it probably since the 80s, really. And I was kind of just struck at how good it was. And then from my own standpoint in comics, when Devil's Due got the license back in the early 2000s, during that kind of 80s craze that was going on in comics, everything 80s in the early aughts was super hot in comics. All of those IPs, Masters, G.I. Joe, Transformers, they were all launched into their own comics. Devil's Due Publishing had the IP from Hasbro. I colored G.I. Joe for 2 years while it was at Devil's Due because I was kind of their in-house guy in Chicago. I lived about 20 minutes from the studio and did a lot of stuff. I did Voltron, I did Transformers, I did G.I. Joe. And that iteration of Joe that we were doing at Devil's Due was very much tied to the cartoon. very much. We tried to kind of get a little bit edgy. We paralyzed Flint. We killed Scarlet. Yeah, we did a bunch. Yeah,
Cobra very interest in that character. Okay, and I mean, when Joe and Tom hired me, it was, hey, we named a character after you. You have to take the job. Okay, which probably was untrue.
Actually, it was Hawk. I'm sorry, we paralyzed Hawk.
Oh, good. Yeah, you can do whatever you want.
We had Cobra Commander shoot him in the back, and then we put him in a wheelchair.
I have Flint problems. I have no Hawk problems. All right. So while this is going on, I got a text from a guy on my Facebook page who is welcome to identify himself on the page if he wants to. But this is just interesting. He said, "What's funny about my 80s?" He's watching this. What's funny about my 80s experience was about as far from yours and Paul's as possible. The Cold War was full on, and Soviets were up to their eyeballs in Afghanistan. I joined during the Reagan era. He was special operations. So he was like actually G.I. Joe.
Yeah, right.
When we were writing about G.I. Joe, I met him much later on when I was doing stuff for the government. But I mean, it's just very interesting to have that sort of chip in there. He's like, running around doing counterinsurgency operations in Afghanistan while we're writing, and Flint parachutes in, the Sky Striker, and Ace is down, and there's something very funny about this. It's just kind of reality sort of intriguing.
I've met a lot of guys from those communities, and G.I. Joe tends to be a pretty universal concept to those guys.
Well, that's because I mean, here was the thing is, the 80s, and it's a Reagan era, and it was not like it is now. Yes, there were political differences, but it wasn't, it's not like today. That's what I hope we leave back in COVID-18.
Same here.
And when we get to COVID-20, all that's shrunk and gone in the rearview mirror, because I want the 80s back. I want that attitude of that. Yeah, people, the people liked Reagan or didn't like Reagan, but like everybody was on the same team.
Exactly. Yeah.
And we knew there was problems with G.I. Joe with Europe, in that it looked like American jingoistic Cold War stuff, so they called it Action Force.
Action Force, right?
Yeah, but remember, Cobra was not the Soviets. Cobra was this enemy organization, basically a criminal. I mean, the thing about as a teaser for season 1, and we can kick off from there, but let's not get too deep into it. I'd really like to have Buzz here because he's the closest. Yeah. Living thing that runs the gamut of this is that season 1, I mean, we like these guys, and obviously in the background were all the 80s action heroes, but I never once said this guy Schwarzenegger, this guy is Jean-Claude Van Damme. I never heard that. Or whoever else, the big stars. This is Mel Gibson. I mean, nobody thought like that. They're just those characters. And Steve and I tended to think of it. They started out, Ron Friedman wrote the miniseries, which is really funny because people think of him as a Transformers guy. He actually wrote the miniseries, and he did a brilliant job because what he did was he laid out a vision for what the world was. Steve and I looked at it and thought it was, this is a James Bond show with just a whole lot of characters. And we thought of it more as being espionage and all that, because we knew you couldn't keep the military out of it, but it had to be something more than just take that hill.
Right.
But I mean,
that's what I always thought was that Cobra was basically Spectre with army uniforms and lasers.
Exactly. Right.
Spectre. No political affiliations or loyalties to anybody other than just,
Well, and I was fully aware of the Cold War and the Soviets during that era. I mean, and what's interesting is my mom and my mom's side of the family, and even my 3rd and 4th grade teacher were lifelong Democrats. They all voted for Reagan. Everybody loved Reagan back then, largely, and especially in '84, everybody loved Reagan. Just going.
Biggest political landslide in American history. Remember that night? Were you there that night, Paul? When it was my birthday happens to fall on election day many years.
Yeah, it does. Yeah,
and election day happened to be the '84 election. And Paul will tell you, I have a giant model of the HMS Victory because of a bet I won with my sister on the election. So, so I had this election party, and I was the only person that I know of to have voted for Ronald Reagan. This is Hollywood, right?
Right.
And everybody expected, and everybody has forgotten this, that it looked like Mondale could win it. And we're sitting there at this party. Everybody's forgotten that at that moment in Southern California, people believe, that Mondale was going to win. And we're sitting there watching this thing in the course of the night, the map's turning redder and redder and redder, and it's just like sweeping across the country. And like people are trying to like pretend that they care about my birthday, but they're getting kind of pissed off. And it ended early.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't. Reagan did not campaign in Minnesota, Mondale's home state, largely because he wanted to leave him with some dignity, which ended up being the only state that Mondale won.
He campaigned there really early on because Richard Nixon told Reagan, he said, "Look, here's how you beat Mondale: you go carpet bomb him, and that is go hit him in places where he's got to defend his home turf."
Right.
Okay, Nixon called it carpet bombing, and so Reagan was campaigning in Minnesota. So all of a sudden, Mondale's campaigning in his home state and didn't have time to campaign in states he could have plausibly won.
Brilliant.
But I mean, in retrospect, that was never going to be close, and it was. But the first debate, where everybody forgets this too, is the first debate. Reagan was really shaky, and people thought they were running very much like the Joe Biden thing about dementia.
Yeah.
And they were doing that. And second debate, he came out with the youth and inexperience of my opponent.
Right. And they were using it against him. Yeah.
And that was game over.
Great line.
But everybody forgets that incumbent presidents always lose the first debate.
Yeah, but I getting back to the original point, I always looked at Cobra as sort of being like Spectre, the stuff that I had seen in the Bond movies, kind of this criminal organization just bent on world domination and power. It had nothing to do with communism. However, I think that iteration of Joe worked.
There was no political implication to Spectre whatsoever. They were criminals. We thought about them literally at one point, and I'm feeling really guilty about stepping on G.I. Joe right here. But at one point, I did an alignment chart like you do for Dungeons and Dragons with G.I. Joe and Cobra, and you had lawful evil, neutral, neutral evil and chaotic evil, and then you had lawful good, neutral good, and chaotic good, and then you had the neutrals in the middle, which were anybody who wasn't a character for sale. And there were actually even some of the Cobra guys I thought of as being kind of neutral and not evil. But build every square in that box, and then we had the series. So because like lawful evil does not like chaotic evil,
right?
And Chris Latta voicing Cobra Commander, that's chaotic evil. I don't care what the guy does. And Destro is a great man. And then Transformers is flipped. Well, once again, Chris Latta plays Starscream,
right?
And Megatron's is the normal lawful evil, but what made the flip work is you had the crazy guy at the top.
Yeah,
if that makes any sense. I mean, Destro, you can deal with Destro and you can reason with Destro.
Oh yeah. Even in the comic, we had G.I. Joe actually make a deal with Destro. In order to turn over Cobra Commander. I mean, he was always the one that you could somehow buy off, but Cobra Commander was always just insane. There's no reasoning with insanity.
And then the neutral evils were, the corporate kind of guys, Zamax and Tomat, and the Crimson
mercenaries.
Mercenaries, right?
And the other chaotics were like the Dreadnoks.
Yeah.
We had this figured out, and we wanted to balance every episode with all that stuff because it made the forces much more dimensional.
Yeah. Really, I mean, the military aspect of Joe from that era, I think, couldn't have ever happened without just, I think, sort of that patriotism that sort of ran rampant across the country during that era. And even in that Toys That Made Us doc on Joe, they talk about that was a big influence on Hasbro's decision to bring Joe back after being dormant for so many years, and especially bring him back in the 3 3/4 inch and sort of redefine everything and recreate everything. So it's a fascinating time and a fascinating era, and such an amazing IP. And the only IP that I was told this many times when I would get revisions back on my coloring, like take that blood off of Storm Shadow's katana blade, or this is still GI Joe. This isn't this isn't a movie. This isn't film. Even though that's what I was trying to make
nobody's
it into.
getting disinvolved in this. Nobody's. I mean, because that was the thing. I mean, Steve's pitch to me in the beginning, because after a brutal experience at Lucasfilm that Paul and I will tell you about next time. I came back and I thought I was garnished, and Steve Gerber calls me up and says, "Hey, you want to work on GI Joe? You can hit people with real fists." And then it was like this incredible liberating moment. Real fists, because Saturday morning TV at that point was so oppressive that your villain couldn't do anything that would in a court be anything worse than negligence.
Right.
Okay, and so, which I think was really a good training ground for us, because you had to think of all sorts of death equivalents and violence equivalents and jeopardies, and you had to think way outside of the box and somehow get an exciting action adventure show when you couldn't have any action or adventure.
What's interesting?
That was the thing. I was watching some old Saturday morning cartoons, some old shows, both live and animated, from I guess the late 60s to mid 70s, and there's an incredible amount of just sort of like kind of violence in it, but it's not like lethal violence. It's like lazy violence. Characters are they'll give a wisecrack and then somebody else will bonk them on the head, or you'll see a hand extending an animation and bonk somebody, or somebody.
Well, by the time we were early years, you couldn't even do that. I mean, what you had to have was somebody. You could yell at them, and that would be 4 violence points. So you couldn't really yell; they'd knock it down to 2 violence points. You could softly say something bad. However, you could accidentally push a chair out of the way. So when you ran away and they fell over the chair, that was your action beat. You couldn't like put the chair in their way, but you could accidentally, if it didn't look like you intended to do violence.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that the reason that happened was laziness on the part of the writers and producers 10 years before. It was written by slapstick who were in short cartoons, and it's like character gets bonked, character gets dropped off a cliff. It's like they didn't have to come up with anything, so it forced us later, like, you can't do this, you can't
we
do
were
this.
Forced to. We were forced to
to
come up with stuff. I remember Gordon Kent going 16 rounds with, I think it was CBS, over, they would live and have a pirate ship. It's a pirate story, right? Sold as a pirate story. You could have a pirate ship, but if you had a cannon, you couldn't have cannonballs. Okay, the level of insanity it got to, I mean, I know that was a nightmare version of the world that was coming, but it was, but anyway, have us back. I got to haul off here because I got 5 minutes before the next thing. Or you guys can stick around if you want to, but I got to take off.
Well, can we go ahead and get you guys to pitch anything you got coming up? And we'd love to have you for just a second afterwards and everything. We'll go ahead and start writing this up. What do you guys got going on right now?
You want to go first, Paul?
I'm just doing Batman. I'm writing some Batman stuff.
Just Batman.
Alan Burnett. We're doing kind of a continuation of the animated series in comic book form for DC. That's a lot of fun. I have a ton of solo one-shot stories coming out starting next month and going through the end of the year. And there's a ton of stuff I can't talk about. With my writing partner, Steve Langford, I have and he's got some great perspective on 90s shows too, as far as like sitcoms. And we were just talking on another podcast about the optimism of sitcoms from the 90s that he worked on. We're writing for a Creep Show on Shudder and doing some stuff like that. So a lot of interesting stuff. I know there's a ton of stuff I just can't talk about right now. But
all future projects are things you can't talk about. I mean, the big thing I have coming up that I can talk about is the book. So if you're watching this and wants like the full version, all these stories, go get the book, and we can come back afterwards and like I'll fill in all the stuff I forgot to put in the book. But that's the big thing I can talk about. But the way it works in the world is all future projects, you can't talk about them. And for a variety of reasons. I have a DARPA project, which is totally unrelated to this, but I found myself after GI Joe days working on the real military, which is kind of interesting thing.
Wow.
But, it's a thing called polyplexes, and it's for scientists and engineers, but I won't bore you with that. Nobody wants to hear about that. But that, and then everything else. But there's stuff coming out, and there'll be some announcements. And I kind of slipped and leaked some stuff. And Paul and I are going to huddle up on our found project from the 80s, and we'll tell you about it when we can.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Brett, what do you got coming up?
I've got a graphic novel that I produced with Chuck Dixon, and the artist is Derlis Santa Cruz, who's a DC guy. That's coming out in September. It's called Blood, and it's a werewolf western. And it was produced by some Hollywood guys who wanted to do a graphic novel first to develop an audience, and then they're going to go shoot it for live action sometime next year. But it's a 98-page graphic novel. It turned out just beautifully. Chuck Dixon and I have worked on a number of different projects before, and so this was a lot of fun to get the band back together. And then I'm also got another project with Chuck called Agent Poso, which is a 32-page comic, which I'm wrapping up now, and that was crowdfunded. That'll start to get that'll probably be at the printer in sometime next month, and it'll start being shipped to all of our wonderful backers. And I've got two other projects, one of which I'm developing with Chuck Dixon and Graham Nolan, and that was supposed to start pre-lockdown, and it got delayed. So we're hoping that as America reopens and gets back to normal, we can reconvene and start that project. So all good stuff.
Yeah. Well, guys, thank you all for coming out. We're absolutely going to have you all back, hopefully sooner rather than later, because I want to dig into some G.I. Joe with you guys. But thank you for coming out. And Mike, if you want to go ahead and start shutting it down, brother.
All right. Thanks for tuning in today. If you enjoyed what you saw, be sure to give us a like and subscribe to the channel. If you have any ideas on what you'd like to see on a future show, leave us a comment and we'll take a look. Stay tuned for more information on next week's